If you're a frequent listener to the InfoQ podcast, you're likely familiar with Envoy Proxy and today's guest. If not, Envoy is a high-performance C++ distributed proxy designed for single services and applications, as well as a communication bus and universal data plane in large microservice architectures. In other words, Envoy is often used to handle north-south traffic as an ingress and east-west traffic via sidecar roles for individual apps and or part of a larger distributed system. Envoy is used as a foundation for ingress controllers, API gateways like Contour, and emissary ingress, formerly known as Ambassador API Gateway, and in that sidecar role that I mentioned before, and service meshes like Istio and Kong-Kuma and Solos Glue Mesh and many others. It's safe to say that Envoy is a foundational piece of lower-level technology in many, many cloud-native environments today. It's also safe to say that when you're operating at that level, it's not always the easiest component to use. Several weeks ago, the group behind the CNCF graduated Envoy Proxy announced Envoy Gateway, a new member of the Envoy Proxy family aimed at significantly decreasing the barrier to entry when using Envoy for API gateway use cases, those north to south use cases I mentioned. Hi, my name is Wes Reisz. I'm a principal technologist at ThoughtWorks working in the cloud native and app modernization space. I also chair the QCon SF software conference that will be happening later this year in October in the Bay Area. So check us out at QConSF.com if you're interested in that. Today on the podcast, we're speaking with Matt Klein, the creator of Envoy, about Envoy Gateway. Matt is a software engineer working at Lyft, or if you look at his LinkedIn profile, a plumber, who has had roles for about 7 years, I believe, working at Lyft. And then he's also had other roles with Twitter and AWS, working on things like app development, proxy, networking, edge, those types of things. So as always, thank you for joining us on your jogs, walks, and commutes. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I thought we'd start off and give you a chance to kind of shout out the community. Last time you were on the podcast, I believe, was with Daniel Bryant, 2019, talking about Envoy Mobile. So at that point, I believe Envoy was incubating in the CNCF. So you've graduated now. So what's happened? What's happened in the ecosystem in the last couple of years?
What's happened, I guess, is the COVID time warp. It's hard to imagine that, 2.5 or 3 years has gone by. But, I think in general, we've just continued to see the explosive growth of Envoy, which obviously blows my mind. I mean, never in my wildest dreams when I started the project would I have imagined that we'd be where we are today. We see Envoy used, as you mentioned, in many north-south use cases. We see it used in many east-west or internal service-to-service use cases. We have Envoy Mobile now. We have Envoy used in such a variety of situations that I never would have imagined it. So from my perspective, at least among the larger enterprises around the world, we've just seen the explosive adoption of Envoy. I mean, it's not an over-exaggeration to say that Envoy is used almost everywhere. When you use your phone, you are interacting with Envoy in a great majority of services now, which is truly incredible. And we'll obviously get into it within this podcast, but I think Envoy Gateway is something that excites me because I think though we've seen Envoy just have that explosive growth among large orgs, it hasn't been quite as pervasive among the long tail of users. And I'm excited, with Envoy Gateway to hopefully bring Envoy to even more users.
Yeah, so let's jump into that. So Envoy Gateway in May, you had an announcement, a blog post that was right around QCon EU, first day or two of QCon EU, if I remember right. You announced a partnership with Ambassador Labs, Tetrate, VMware to create this Envoy Gateway that you're talking about. So why Envoy Gateway? You've always done north to south traffic. So why Gateway?
As you mentioned in your intro, Envoy is a low-level component. It is a very powerful piece of software. It is a very complex piece of software. And I'll be the first to admit that it is not for the faint of heart. And, all of the features that are within Envoy, they're there for a reason. Someone added them for a reason, and they're used in production somewhere. But Envoy is used in so many cases and at such large scale that just the sheer configuration service can be overwhelming for the average user. And as I was saying before, we've seen pervasive adoption of Envoy within larger organizations. We have not seen as pervasive adoption of Envoy among that long tail of smaller users that want something that's smaller and simpler and lighter and just a bit more nimble. And for those use cases within Kubernetes, of course, the Nginx ingress is very popular, and there's other types of ingresses that people might use. Now, I'm obviously biased. I think Envoy is a fantastic piece of software. software, from a performance perspective, from an observability perspective, just the sheer volume of features that it brings to the table. But when it's very easy for people to go on blogs and go on the internet and search for how do I do ingress within Kubernetes, and the first thing that pops up is the Nginx ingress controller, I don't blame them. Of course, that's the thing that they are going to use. So I think there's an understanding within the larger community that if we can have a layer on top of the core Envoy proxy that has a simplified deployment model, a simplified configuration API, and we can bring that to users with the Envoy brand, which I think is very important to people. People really trust the Envoy brand itself in terms of the community aspect, the quality aspect. I think the thinking is that if we can coalesce a lot of development around a value-added layer that can make it simpler for people to get started with some of those ingress, north-south, API gateway use cases, we're going to be able to hit a lot of those long tail cases. Our goal, is to have Envoy and the power of Envoy usable by everyone. It shouldn't matter if you're a giant organization with a full-time networking team or if you're a smaller group and you just want to get the benefits of Envoy. We believe that there should be a product or a project offering that can scale with you. So Envoy Gateway is the idea that if we can bring together a bunch of the existing projects that are already attempting to do this, we can avoid re-implementing the wheel because we have a lot of projects that are doing a lot of the same low-level work. We can build something together that has the Envoy brand very simply named. And we can just get Envoy into more people's hands and they can get the benefit of Envoy. And our belief really at the end of the day is that this is a virtuous cycle because the more people that use Envoy, it's a flywheel effect where, then it's a rising tide lifts all boats. We get more people using Envoy, we get more inbound for the companies on top that are offering value-added management, planes and security services and all of these things. And it just makes the entire ecosystem more powerful. So in summary, the goal of Envoy Gateway is to bring a basic set of north-south API gateway use cases to everyone and lead into a funnel where a lot of the companies today no longer have to re-implement the wheel over and over and over again. They can now focus on value-added user interfaces, value-added features, value-added management planes. And our general belief is that this will lead to a better outcome for everyone.
So help me understand something. There's a couple tools that come to mind, Contour, Emissary in particular, that offer solutions in the space that wrap Envoy. So they're behind this. They're already part of this. They have buy-in to this. So I think you may have answered the question when you said like a basic set or a limited set. How is it different than what Emissary or Contour are already doing by creating Envoy Gateway?
From a core feature set perspective, it's honestly not very different. And we can talk about this in more detail, but there's a parallel effort within Kube. It's a little confusing because there's API Gateway and then there's the Gateway API. And this, I think, confuses almost everyone. Probably could have had some better names, but it is what it is. So the Gateway API is a API that's being developed by a Kubernetes working group. And that is basically the next generation of the Ingress API within Kubernetes. So we have said that the Gateway API is going to be the simplified API that Envoy Gateway will use. And if you look around, Contour had already been developing support for the Gateway API, and so had Emissary, and so had a bunch of the other vendors on top of Envoy. And so I think you're correct in asking, what is the difference? From a core feature set perspective, honestly, there isn't that much difference. The Gateway API has a specific set of functionality. The biggest difference is what I was talking about before, is that each of these vendors is re-implementing the same exact functionality, which is a wrapper on top of Envoy. They all have to deal with rolling security patches. They all have to deal with configuration best practices. They all have to deal with developing their own almost the same but slightly different control plane. So there's a huge amount of duplication of effort there that is doing two things. It is bifurcating the larger ecosystem. So if you're a consumer and you just want to get started within the CNCF ecosystem, you're going to say, I don't know, do I use Envoy? Do I use Contour? Do I use Emissary? Do I use one of these other things? Do I roll my own? It's a bit confusing. So there isn't an Envoy branded entity that is taking this basic functionality. But more importantly for these vendors, because they're all re-implementing the same functionality, which in my opinion is table stakes, it's kind of a commodity at this point. They're not investing development effort into more powerful features that would add value, whether that be user interfaces or additional security features, or again, like the list goes on and on and on. So it's not that Envoy Gateway's goal is to be the ultimate gateway solution. It is certainly not. I mean, this is really a getting started tool that can get people into using Envoy for these cases, that can implement the Kubernetes Gateway API and onboard people into the value of Envoy. Now, they might offboard to a commercial vendor for a variety of different reasons, whether that's commercial support, whether that's security patches, whether that's some vendor has a better user interface. There's 100 different reasons that people might move away from the pure open source to a commercial offering. What we're trying to do is we're trying to, again, reduce the duplication of effort, give people a better out-of-box experience with the Envoy brand, and make it so that the vendors can actually compete with each other on real value and not just duplicating the same thing over and over again.
Totally makes sense. Everybody can stand on your shoulders, to quote a term, but rather than re-implementing those things that are part of the core API. Got it. All right. So this is a wrap around the core API. What does that mean for the core proxy, for XDS, the control plane, the Go control plane? Any of that changing with Envoy? Is it the same?
For those that don't know, Envoy's API is called XDS, and that is written X, the letter XDS. It originally was star DS for Star Discovery Service. So we have a lot of different APIs that discover various resources. This API has grown to be very large. It is a very large API, and this is what I was referring to before. The configuration service is large, and it's not just used by Envoy anymore. It's used by gRPC. It's used by other proprietary systems. So we've developed an API that now is larger than just Envoy. So you can think of this in terms of layers. Almost at the base layer is XDS now. That is an API that is used by a variety of different entities, including Envoy. Then there's the core Envoy Proxy, which implements the XDS API. On top of that, we have different pieces like Go Control Plane, which is a library that allows people to build their custom XDS servers. And then Envoy Gateway is a layer yet on top that's going to consume these various pieces, Envoy Proxy, XDS, Go Control Plane, and it's going to implement the Gateway API. It'll be within the Envoy Proxy organization. Again, Envoy branded, Apache 2 license. There'll be no fancy name, Envoy Gateway. And our hope is that that just is another layer that then the vendors can build on, and it just makes the whole ecosystem go faster and hopefully do better things.
But nothing's changing for the core proxy, the XDS, the APIs, Go control plane, all those things remain the same.
Nothing changes. So it's a layered system of components, and people can plug into whatever layer is most comfortable for them. The goal is to, for many use cases, is to avoid people having to dig into that lowest layer when they probably don't need it. And that lowest layer, it's a double-edged sword because it is the reason that Envoy has become so popular with large users, but it's also the reason, that you'll see a lot of people who don't have as much time to invest in learning technology, or the problems that they're trying to solve are not quite as complicated. They'll look at Envoy and they'll throw up their hands and say, this is the most ridiculously complicated piece of software that I've ever seen. Like, I possibly cannot use this. And unfortunately, in technology, you can't satisfy both camps with one piece of software. It's impossible. So the only way that we can attempt to do this is through this layered approach.
So one of the things that you mentioned in the blog post, and then you just mentioned a primary goal, a first principle that you're working towards is a simplified deployment model. So what does that mean in practice? How do you see this working? Like, you've got a cluster and you want to get ingress north-south. How are you reducing that cognitive load and simplifying the process?
So one thing to point out is that Envoy itself, the word Kubernetes never appears in the Envoy code base, right? So like Envoy did not start as a Kubernetes specific project. It actually has no direct tie into Kube. And that is on purpose because Envoy is used in a ton of different deployment models, and it is true that Kubernetes has obviously swept the world, but there's a lot of non-Kubernetes workloads out there. So it is an intentional design decision that Envoy does not have a direct dependency on Kubernetes.
That's a really good call out, though. Thank you for saying that.
Right. So with that said, working on Kubernetes is obviously very important, and that's something that is probably the first case that we really want to push towards. So when you talk about a simplified deployment model, I think what that means is initially is a Kubernetes first deployment model. So that means scripts that can automatically install a Kubernetes controller, like something that actually can spin up proxies that can handle the entire lifestyle, something that obviously natively understands the gateway API CRDs and then can translate those to Envoy and make those happen. So that's basically what I'm talking about in terms of that simplified model. It is just making it easier to be Kubernetes first. Now, with that said, even within the Envoy Gateway project, it is likely that we will ultimately support non-Kubernetes workloads. It's an ongoing decision, though, in terms of how that happens, because like any other piece of software, the less opinionated you are, the more configuration knobs there are. And then we enter this same vicious cycle where you add more knobs, more features, people get confused. So I think there's an open set of decisions to be made around how is this composed in terms of, for example, is there one Envoy Gateway project that handles different deployment models, or is there an Envoy Gateway Kubernetes edition? Is there an Envoy Gateway console edition? Is there an Envoy Gateway on-prem edition? And I think those are some of the things that we have to think through. But the goal, again, is for individual use cases to make them targeted, to make them what we call batteries included, which means that you should be able to get started quickly. So I have a cluster with Kubernetes. There should be a script that can just boom, get me started with launching the controller, run some proxies, basically adhere to the gateway API and get people running. And then the other part of north-south that ends up getting unfortunately complicated is you are still at the whim of how you egress and ingress from the internet, right? Like it's not like you can just stand up containers and suddenly they're accepting internet traffic. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So whether you're running within AWS or you're running in some other environment, there's going to be hooks to make it so that it's a more seamless experience. But that's the goal in terms of a simplified deployment environment.
So what I'm hearing is you'll apply some YAML, you'll apply a CRD to create your ingress to be able to map into containers, but it'll just be into the running pods, but it'll just be like the core essential gateway API objects that are being exposed with that experience. So it's the same experience. It's just you're not deciding between different projects that may be out there. It's just the core API ingress experience to get to a route.
Exactly. And then from that, our hope, as I was mentioning, our hope is that given that Envoy is so tightly integrated into the CNCF ecosystem as part of the CNCF set of graduated projects, our hope is that ultimately we can move to a world in which when someone is blogging about a demo, for ingress for Kubernetes, that Envoy Gateway would be the natural vendor neutral solution, for onboarding people into that CNCF environment and to that Envoy experience. And then, as I mentioned, our goal here is not to take away from the value that vendors can provide. Vendors are one of the primary reasons that Envoy has had the velocity to get where it is today. So we want to empower vendors. We don't want to cannibalize vendors. So the goal is to hopefully just take on a lot of that boring plumbing and allow the vendors to add value on top.
Makes total sense. I get it. One of the things we've talked a little bit, we've almost used them interchangeably over the podcast, and that's with API Gateway and Ingress. How do you talk to people about the difference? Both are doing in north-south, but they're like architectural things. How do you talk to people about like this infrastructure thing that's an API Gateway versus like a role of an Ingress?
I think as an industry, frankly, we've done a poor job of using consistent nomenclature here. I think you're going to hear people say API gateway, edge proxy, ingress controller, and in many ways, they're going to use them interchangeably. I don't even know that I can honestly tell you what the difference is, because from my perspective, and I would consider myself an expert here, I don't think there really is much of a difference. So I think it's more useful for me to come at it from the perspective of, in modern internet architectures, I have an edge component that is sitting between the internet and my backend systems. And I can call this the ingress or the API gateway or the edge proxy, but it's better to focus on the functionality. The functionality that these things typically provide are going to be TLS termination, obtaining TLS certificates, authentication, authorization, WAF. Again, like all of the common pieces there that people typically want to do on their perimeter. And I think you'll hear people talk about this interchangeably. And again, you can see this even within the naming. The V1 of the Kubernetes API was the Ingress API, and now it's called the Gateway API. I think the names don't mean too much, and I would focus more on the functionality personally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so to carry on with that, when you say batteries included, I get the core set of components, but then what does batteries included mean? I took that to mean like WAF and things like that I can plug in for common use cases.
Yeah, so that's something that we would certainly like to provide. I think batteries included probably means something different to different people. I think the first stage of batteries included is if I am running a kube cluster, there is a script like start envoy gateway.sh, right? That will check that the controllers are there, start some proxies, like make the thing work, right? Based on what environment you're actually running in. So that's batteries included part one. It should just work. There should be a way of automatic, like there's builds ready, there's all the things that are ready to go. Run a script with the right permissions, go. The second stage of batteries included are the Kubernetes Gateway API is still a work in progress. There's basic functionality specified, but I think that there is actually a lot of interesting API work around not only the Gateway API, but let's just call it running Envoy, right? Like what is the Envoy API for running Envoy within Kubernetes? And that's going to be potentially exposing some Envoy specific functionality around Envoy's rate limiting services and authentication and security and WAF, and like the list goes on and on and on. So I think from that perspective, we would also like to have a batteries included system that can do some of these pieces, whether that be things like OAuth or rate limiting. And these might not be solutions that will scale or adhere to every large organization's requirements, but it should be enough that the average user can get started. They can get started out of the box and have something working that's supported by the core project. And then if their needs move beyond what the basic open source can provide, and again, that might be needs on support, that might be needs on FIPS builds, that might be needs on, they need some auditing that the core project doesn't provide. There can be many different reasons they might outgrow that core project. Our goal is that they can move to a vendor who would offer them value, and they wouldn't have to change all the APIs that they're currently using.
Because it's all built on the same foundation. Totally makes sense. Okay, one last question before we wrap. I noticed Tetrate does a lot of work, obviously, with Istio. So I'm curious, is that just for ingress? What is the relationship like to service meshes as part of this particular API gateway focused north-south kind of conversation? Is there a larger story there, or what's the relationship?
I think the larger story is that, as you might imagine, the overlap between what an API gateway, quote unquote, north-south use cases versus a service mesh, quote unquote, east-west use cases. If you look at the functionality they provide, very, very, very similar, right? 99% similar in terms of what they're doing. And in fact, as the world moves to zero trust networking, it's even more similar, right? Because you're applying a lot of the same security principles, whether you're at the edge or whether you're within your internal network. So I think what you're seeing from a lot of these vendors is the natural evolution to a combined approach, right? It's like, we see that with Kong. Kong has Kuma now. We see that with Tetrate, who might want to move into the API gateway space. I think, and this is me just speaking for myself, I think that if you're a customer, whether you're a customer of open source or you're a customer of a commercial project, I think most customers want less throats to choke, as it were, right? It's like no one wants to use more software, right? It's like it would be better to use less. And that is also, from an open source perspective, one of the reasons that Envoy's become really popular is that pre-Envoy, we saw a lot of deployments in which people would use Nginx at the edge. They'd use like HA Proxy internally or other pieces of software or hardware load balancers. And we've seen people just replace everything with Envoy. And they do that, maybe one of these other pieces of software, maybe they perform better in certain roles. That's very possible. But from an operability perspective, people like one piece of software, right? It's like, they know how to monitor it. They know how to modify it. They know how to debug it. For me personally, moving forward, I think in the platform space, as a customer, I want less software, not more. I want less vendors, not more, right? So I just tend to think that we're going to see more convergence in this space because the functionality is so similar. And if you're providing value-added user interfaces and functionality on top, it almost definitely applies equally to the edge as it does for your internal network. So that might not have been exactly the question that you asked, but I think that's why you're seeing what you're seeing is that there's a general convergence towards platforms. And I think that we're just going to continue to see more people move towards platforms that combine compute and edge networking and service-to-service networking.
It was a poorly worded question, but you answered it in a nice way, so I appreciate that. All right, so what's next? You corrected me when we first did this. I wrote down the wrong number. We've got 20,000 stars on GitHub now. Graduated CNCF, Envoy Mobile. You mentioned Envoy's running on these phones when you're interacting with it. You've now Envoy Gateway. What's next for Envoy?
I think at this point, the project, we are entering a phase of focusing more on sustainability. And I mean sustainability just in terms of the project itself, making sure that we have enough maintainers, making sure that CI continues to function, making sure that we have funding for everything. I'd be lying if I said, that we're trying to conquer some pocket of use that's not using Envoy because, as I mentioned before, it blows my mind. Envoy is used so pervasively now. So I think we're just trying to make sure that the project scales for the long term. And that's from a security focus, from a maintainer focus. There's continued investment in WebAssembly. I think there's some interesting potential moving forward of application platform type components of actually running or application pieces via WebAssembly within Envoy. But I would say the number of big bang features is decreasing over time, and we're moving more towards just admitting a fact that we're a critical part of the internet plumbing and trying to make sure that the project stays healthy.
Well, Matt, as always, thank you for taking the time to jump on the podcast with us and talk to us about what Envoy's working on.
Of course, thank you for having me anytime.